So, Chad Fowler is going to be talking to us tonight. I picked him up at the airport an hour or so ago. Happily, I'm almost nervous about meetings in November through February, meetings from November through March, and when we're flying people in, because you just never know, especially when they're flying through Chicago. But I told him this is typically, late November weather for Michigan. And he's never actually been to Michigan before. He might have believed me. Chad's very active in the Ruby community. He was key in establishing the International Ruby Conference, and has done all. The list of Ruby things he's done would be lengthy. He's not here to talk about Ruby or Rails, but that's a significant thing of what he's done, and I'm sure he would entertain those kind of questions later. Most recently, he's published a book called Rails Recipes. Has very good reviews at Amazon, and I've heard some good things about it. I haven't seen a copy yet. He worked for 1.5 years at General Electric in India, and I find this to be very, very interesting because he has first-hand direct experience on the ground with working with Indian developers for offshore development for a large multinational. I think that's a very interesting experience and relevant to what he's going to talk about tonight. His most recent job was rewriting an application in PHP that was the accumulation of 5 years of development time, and they rewrote it in Rails in 11 months. He is the author of the book, My Job Went to India, 52 Things You Can Do to Save Your Job, and that's actually the theme of what he'll be talking about tonight. Our schedule is going to be the usual schedule. Chad will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we can take a break and snack. He won't take any questions at the end of that 45. We'll just take our break and snack, and then we'll come back together. That's when questions are going to come in. And in an hour and a half or so, I've been able to talk with him since the airport. I think you're going to find this very interesting. It's going to get all sorts of interesting discussion and questions going. So please just think of, hold them through your snacking, and then we'll have the rest of the evening until 8 when we officially break out for those questions. Some advice that Chad gave to one of my developers, one of our young guys, a year or so ago when we met at the conference, I think says a lot about Chad, in that he's got a name for himself now. He's Chad Fowler, and that's why we brought him here, right? Because I knew his name. And I figured it would draw 50 people like it did. And he has interesting things to say. But, what really struck me was the advice he gave to one of our guys, which was, look, it's not like you're born being a name. You just do good work. It's a very humble attitude. And I find that very refreshing for someone who has some pretty interesting ideas and valuable stuff to share with the world. So if you help me welcome Chad Fowler.
All right, thanks. I was going to start by introducing myself, so I'll do that, but I'll tell you all of the stuff that didn't already get covered. That was very thorough. We'll start with the fact that I'm not really a programmer or a software developer at all. I'm actually a jazz saxophone player and maybe a punk rock guitar player, but not really a software developer. At least that's how I think of myself. I was educated as a jazz saxophonist and a classical music composer. So I wrote, classical music is a bad term for those of you who are snobby and nerdy like I am, but I wrote like chamber music and orchestral music and that sort of thing. And I had planned this huge life as a composer, only to be distracted one summer at the end of my 6 years in college, after which I didn't get a degree, distracted by the video game Doom. So this tells you how long I've been at this, and it's actually not very long. That's part of the message here. So I started playing Doom, maybe it was 1992 or something like that, when I really got interested in it. And I decided that in the same way that I got into music, I heard music. We all do this sort of, especially a lot of us as high school kids. You hear a band and you really like the band, and then you say, well, they're cool, I'm going to learn how to play the guitar so I can be like that. And you start practicing and you get obsessed with it, and most people throw it away, but I did the same thing with video games. I started playing Doom, and I loved it so much. I was obsessed and addicted. So all the parents that are worried about their kids being addicted to video games, this is maybe a positive thing for you to hear. I got so excited by these video games that I said, I want to do this. I even had, kind of like when you start a band when you're in high school, you come up with the name of the band before you learn how to play an instrument. I knew what the game was going to be. I won't tell you because it's actually kind of offensive, but I knew what the game was going to be. I just had to learn, like, okay, I hear they type things in like Notepad, or I was using DOS Edit at the time. I hear that programmers type things, and then somehow it becomes something you can run. You know, that's where I was. So I would go and I would play saxophone at night in bars. I lived in Memphis, so I did the R&B kind of thing, playing in horn sections. And, you know, sometimes do a little drinking and then come home, play Doom for a few hours, and then get on Gopher and like learn about C programming until I couldn't stay awake anymore. I ended up getting so excited by this that a friend of mine recognized that, oh, you know, you should actually get a job doing this computer stuff because you're doing things like helping people patch their Doom executables so they can cheat and that kind of stuff. So you could probably help someone fix their computer too. So my friend named Walter, he actually, he kept telling me you should do this, and I thought, no, I'm going to Yale, I'm going to be a composer, and you know, this is just a fun hobby. So he ended up applying for a job for me as a computer support technician. And actually, footnote, I'm telling you my life history here because it actually will be relevant momentarily. And if it's not, you know, just keep thinking it will be, and then I can leave before that doesn't actually end up being true. So he applied for a job for me, and then he called me and said, you have an interview tomorrow. So I went to the interview. This was at the university where I attended school, and his boss, who was going to interview me, said, well, Walter says you're good, so when do you start? You know, I don't know anything about how to do any kind of networking or computer support or any of this stuff, but I started and instantly got really kind of infatuated with the system administration side of things. You know, I started as a computer, like a help desk person, and as a help desk person, people would call me and they'd say, how do I do such and such? And I'd say, well, what is that? And then they'd explain what they're trying to do, and I would go into help and find out, you know. So I was just learning on the phone. I started there, but then I saw these people walking through and not having to sit at the desk and deal with these idiotic users, and so they were actually going out and fixing computers. I wanted to do that. You know, I got infatuated, and I started building my way toward, a year later, being a, I forget what I was called, Systems Programmer 2, or some kind of strange university title, where I was doing network programming, building a universal authentication system for the university. So, and you know, in between those 2 points, of course, there were many late nights doing things like downloading Linux images to floppies and installing them on my computer and that kind of thing. So this was about 10 years ago, I guess. And since then, I've progressed fairly rapidly by most definitions of the whole IT career thing. So I went to a big corporation. Since we're videotaping, I won't say what it is now, but you already heard it. I went to a big corporation. I became leader of application architecture for that corporation fairly quickly after I joined the company. Then I got really, really excited by software process, as I assume most of you are, since you're here at an XP meeting. I ended up getting 14 of our people to attend an XP immersion class that Object Mentor does. Has anyone heard of XP Immersion, the Object Mentor course? I'm not even sure if it still exists. I think it's called Agile Immersion now. In those days, it was a week-long course taught by Kent Beck and Ron Jeffries, and they would have Martin Fowler and people like that come in to do nighttime sessions. So we basically filled the entire class with our people. We were all gung-ho, really excited about it. But we also had this nasty thing kind of all, you know, eating at us as we got excited about this new methodology, and that was our corporation's commitment to doing offshoring. So who does offshoring at your companies now? Not a whole lot of you. It was pretty much our world. We had been kind of leaders in that space, and I'm not saying that offshoring is a bad thing. I actually got to where I really kind of dug into it. But we wanted to do pure extreme programming. So the whole idea of doing offshoring, and specifically with the kind of fixed price projects that we were pretty much bound to do, really messed us up. So we decided as a division of the company that instead of having a vendor relationship and having swappable, interchangeable resources that, would cycle through projects with their own kind of HR issues and all that, we would start our own software development center. And being in the application architecture role at this company, I was really upset by the code that I was seeing. And I started to get a reputation. I would carry around Martin Fowler's refactoring book and go to where the onshore people were that were working and hold the book up at them, and they would fear me coming over for a code review. So I wanted to inject myself in this situation. And when I found out about the ideas of starting a software development group of our own, I basically sort of sent the word out through the grapevine that I was interested in going to India and helping do it. So that's how I ended up sitting in India for a year and a half. We started with 0 people and we went to 250 people before I left. And I was there, I was in the interview of every single person that got hired up until the first 150 or so. So I got really, really kind of entrenched in this offshoring thing. Ended up sort of playing CEO of a sub-business of this corporation for a while, which was weird for me, being a saxophone player, and not having a college education to speak of, other than the fact that I had taken every possible music class before I graduated and no general ed. Then I came back from India. During all this time, I had gotten into this Ruby thing. This is sort of a parallel deal that I was into. I was doing, at night, small talk, playing with languages like Brain that don't exist anymore. Anyone play with Brain? Brain.sf.net. You can still find an old source tarball. Befunge. I was really into kind of obfuscated languages. And I would learn maybe a language a week, enough to write some programs with it. So I got excited about Ruby, and I became known as the guy who does Ruby for some reason. That was the title, the guy who does Ruby for some reason. Because this is, year 2000. Nobody knows what Ruby is, and Java was just sort of getting its foothold, and that was the hip thing. So Ruby was fringe at the time, And of course, started doing the conferences, and through many sort of twists of fate and luck, ended up kind of famous in the Ruby community. Mostly, if you look through, though, you see that I haven't really done anything important. I've just been present for everything that's happened. So I told you all this stuff. Actually, I should continue. There's another chapter. The other chapter is I say, screw this corporate America thing. I can't stand it anymore. I'm tired of fighting all the time. Every time I go to a big company, there's always that guy at the company. And it's not that guy like at RubyConf. It's that guy that knows there's a better way to do it. And probably a lot of you are that guy or that gal in this room. You know there's a better way to do it, and you can't get the idiots at your company to see it. They know it, and they won't let you do it, It's either agile methodologies or good data measurement or good testing or using a decent technology instead of the old crap or the mainstream crap that they're using at the time. But there's always that guy. I was that guy, and I was so tired of being that guy. So, because fighting makes you tired, So I decided I didn't want to fight anymore, and I left, and I went to a small company. And this was all kind of made possible by the glory of this thing called Rails that has come along and wooed the industry without really doing anything new. I don't know if any of you use Rails, but it's a model view controller web framework written in a language no one cared about. But for some reason, people are excited about it, so I thought, hey, I know Ruby, I'll do Rails, and I got a job doing something I loved. Since then, I have done this massive rewrite of an application. Many people say it's the largest thing attempted with Rails so far. I say that over and over without any kind of actual data on the matter, but no one has beat my numbers yet. And then I recently left that company after having written 2 books, as you know, and co-written a few, and organized RubyConf for several years, and been primarily responsible for the International Rails Conference, which is now going to be co-produced by O'Reilly this year, so it's kind of big. We're going to get huge, 1,200 or more people in Portland, Oregon in May. So now I decided I was going to take a break. I'm going to quit and actually take a long vacation. Writing a book doesn't make you rich, but it lets you do things like take a long vacation. So I wrote 2 while having a full-time job. So I decided to take a break, but I started getting calls and emails, and so now I'm traveling around the world and the country teaching people about Ruby and Rails and doing this kind of stuff, and getting offers to keynote at conferences. I'm not trying to, brag. The reason that I'm telling you all this stuff is that I'm just a saxophone player. And let's see, have I ever taken a computer class? I once took an intermediate Java programming class, but I was doing Perl at the time, and that was only a day. I think that's the only education I've had in computer science. Oh, of course, extreme programming immersion, which is about process, right? So the point here is that I'm not special. And Carl sort of started, things by making that point for me. I'm not special at all. I wrote this book. It has a horrible title. My job went to India, and all I got was this lousy book. We thought it was really funny at the time, and it would get people excited and reach out to the people that are walking by in Walmart or whatever that don't normally look at things like this. But it has a horrible title because I've never been worried about losing. And that title is How Not to Lose, right? 52 Ways Not to Be a Loser. But my philosophy is always, and it's not even something that I've crystallized, it's just the way I've lived. It's always, how can I be there? I always want to be there. I meet someone like Dave Thomas of the Pragmatic Programmers or Kent Beck, and I say, man, that was a smart person. I love talking to that person. I learned so much. I just want to be just like that person so that I can always be in that kind of environment. It's about the book, and sort of the way I've run my career is about how to be the best. Not to beat other people, but just to keep pushing myself and exciting myself and being around smart people and getting to come to places like this and talk to people like you and make new friends and that sort of thing. So the point here is that I'm not special in any way. I'm just this saxophone player that wasn't stupid, or was kind of like too stupid to know that I couldn't do all the things that I've done. And I think for those of you here, I probably won't talk about offshoring very much and the threat that it poses, because I frankly think for most of you it doesn't pose a threat at all. There's actually data that says that we're all going to be having too much work over the next few years by the end of the decade because of demographic changes and that sort of stuff. But the most important thing here is we shouldn't worry about threat, because you don't want to be the kind of person that's worried about being shaved off the bottom. If you are, you need to go do something else. Like maybe you'd be good at the saxophone and you can play for $75 a night or whatever in a bar in Memphis. So I want to talk to you about more specifically how you can do what I've done. And it's really not for everybody. Not everyone wants to write a book. It's kind of a boring thing to do sometimes, and it's stressful and all that. Not everyone wants to get in front of people and talk, this sort of thing. But if you aim for something beyond the next level in your hierarchy, if you work for a big company, you might be a level 24 programmer and you're going for level 25 or whatever. Work beyond that. Work beyond your company and think about how you fit into the industry. And that's how you avoid being shaved off the bottom. But you avoid being shaved off the bottom by never even looking down at the bottom and worrying about it. So I'm hoping that by the end of this, I will have given you some ideas about what you might actually be able to do immediately to take another few steps up pretty quickly. The advice that I gave to the young programmer that we were talking about earlier was probably something like that. I don't remember. But what I probably said is, you seem like a really smart person. Why have I never heard of you before? And I meet so many people like that. Why have I never heard of you? Because I've met a lot of people who are speaking and writing books that are not as smart as you. So why have I not heard of you? And why has the industry not heard of you? Because you have something important to share. The first step in not getting shaved off the bottom and sort of taking this step is to just consider it. So if you look at your coworkers who aren't here, a lot of them are probably kind of like lemmings. Have you played the video game Lemmings? That's my point of reference for it, you know. It's all these little, and it's based on actual creatures, but I think of the video game. It's these little things that are just marching blindly in whatever direction they happen to go. And you set up barricades because they're just going to march until they can't march anymore. Then they're going to turn around and march the other way. Or they're going to fall off a cliff and die. Most software developers are lemmings. So you ask them, you know, why do you do Java? Or what do you prefer, Java or C#? And they just don't even have an opinion. And you know, unfortunately, that's like a majority of the industry. Then the next tier are the people who are really excited about the technology they use, or they have an opinion about it, but it's informed by the group that they're in. They're still sort of following along a certain path, you know. You meet a lot of Java programmers that, what was the one that used to make me sick? A few years ago, people would ask me about like the enterprise Java best practice patterns or some crap, as if it were written in a Bible. And that's another thing that you kind of have to worry about. But by simply sort of looking up and not being a lemming that's walking along the path, you're already not going to get shaved off the bottom, because there's so many people that are just heads down, marching forward, going whatever direction that they're supposed to go, that they're going to fall off the cliff when it shows up. I went to India, as you know. I interviewed, I don't know, countless people, thousands of people, one after another. I got it down to where I could interview people in 5 minutes. And I knew what to say at the beginning so they wouldn't feel bad when I ended the interview quickly. And the thing that would make me the maddest is when I would say, well, have you ever tried a scripting language, for example? And they'd say, no, I've never been given the opportunity to work on a scripting language. And that would be the end of the interview. I would find something polite to say and get rid of them. And it doesn't have to be a scripting language. It's that phrase, never given the opportunity. Now, this is actually a cultural and economic difference. I didn't know so much when I started there. But the best programmers and the best software developers, and frankly the best employees or doers in the world that I've met, don't have to be given an opportunity to do something. They just do it, you know. If you work on Java during the day and you hate it, or you're not able to explore and learn new things, then you go and you spend time at night or in the morning before you go to work, and you learn something if you're truly motivated to learn it. But the people who say, I've never been given an opportunity, those are the lemmings that I'm talking about. Those are the ones that are waiting for a cue from somewhere. You know, they're waiting to be sent training. Anytime someone complains about the fact that they haven't been trained on some technology that's going on in the office, that's a pretty bad sign for their future. So that's the basic thing. Now, as I put together my book, My Job Went to India, and all I got was this lousy book. The idea, of course, was to get people to look up from the path that they're on and maybe take control of it. Because most people, as I'm saying, are, who's read The Pragmatic Programmer? Oh, great. That's a good sign for this group. So in the Pragmatic Programmer, they say something called, it's something like coding by coincidence or something like that. I don't know the exact term. The whole idea is you write code, you write code, you write code, and it just happens to work. You try new APIs, you don't necessarily look them up. You just do enough so that it works. Eventually, you've got this huge, scary thing that may fall apart because you don't really get it. You've just maybe copied and pasted snippets so that you've guided yourself down this path until an app kind of does what it's supposed to do. That's coding by coincidence, and a lot of us do that a lot. You know, those of us here probably don't, because practices like test-driven development help you not do that. But what I think is most software developers have a career that's driven by a set of coincidences. So, you know, you go to school, and most people, when they go to a university, they have no idea what they want to do with their lives. So they choose something that's probably ill-informed, and maybe they finish it, or maybe they switch majors, but eventually they get a degree. Those that get a degree that can get them a software job then enter the workforce. And it's like they've jumped onto a raft that's going down a stream. So wherever the stream goes, they just sit on the raft and they see what happens, and they sort of hopefully adapt to the obstacles in the stream, and they go down through it until the raft falls apart and they drown, or whatever metaphor you want to use there. But I think we should craft our careers. So I'm obviously very metaphor driven. The metaphor that made the most sense to me is thinking in terms of how you would develop a product. So if you think about it, you are sort of a product. You're a thing that sort of delivers services, and you're desirable or not desirable, and there's a price that people have to pay to get those services. And there are some other programmers or project managers or whatever that cost more or less than you, in the same way that a product works. You have certain features, like Java, or how to do RUP, or how to use rational rows or whatever. Those are product features. And then, of course, after you build a product, you have to do things like market it and maintain it and that sort of thing, keep upgrading it. So I thought of developing a career sort of like developing a product. And if you think of it that way, a business has to spend money on you. This is sort of a fundamental issue that a lot of us have as employees. And I will be speaking mostly in the context of being an employee today, although some of you may run your own companies or whatever. I think you'll see how these things apply. So as an employee, you are an expense. And you're a bigger expense than you think, unless you've really kind of dug into the numbers of a company before and you understand total cost to a company. Probably 2.5 times your salary, depending on how good your benefits are and how much your company invests in its people and skills and that sort of stuff. So, imagine that you make $50,000 a year. That means the company probably spends about $125,000 on you. So as a business person, I look at that and I think, for each person here, they have to provide $125,000 worth of value if I'm paying them. I'm basically spending that much. And that's just to break even. This is an oversimplification. But that's just to break even. So, do the number in your head of what you actually make and think about how much your company has to spend or how much value you have to provide. And value means something kind of concrete in most cases. Not in all cases, but think about it concretely for now. Don't worry about how you affect the morale of your team and all that other kind of soft stuff you can't measure. But think about how much revenue you're responsible for generating. If you're an hourly consultant, that's kind of really easy. But if you're sitting as an employee in a salaried position, it's a little harder. Either how much revenue you're generating or how much money you're saving the company in concrete terms. And that tells you how far you are away from the company breaking even on you. Most people I know that work for big companies have no idea what that number is, and they've never even thought about it. Because there's this culture surrounding big companies and employment in the United States in general, I think, where a company is where you go every day and you live. You have part of your life in that company and then part of your life at home. And Americans, a lot of their identity goes to where they work. So they really kind of think about the company as a place that's there for them to go to when they wake up in the morning. Even if they don't want to go to it, it's about them going to it. They don't think about, am I a good investment for my company? Because it is an investment, it grows over time and all that. So if you think about yourself as a product that costs money, then you can also start to think about your product and what it does, what its features are, and that sort of thing. So again, an oversimplified view of product development. If I were going to start a company, I'm CEO of such and such incorporated, I'm going to make a product. There are a few sort of phases of the product development life cycle that I'm going to go through. And those might be, in my oversimplified world, I'm going to research the market and see, what should the product actually be or do. So we know that it's going to be a person in this case that, that's somehow in the IT industry. But what are the features that are necessary? What technologies, so kind of slipping out of the metaphor for a moment, what technologies should I know if I'm a programmer? What processes should I know about? What business skills should I have so that I can fit in and provide real value? So I research and I sort of decide what the product's going to be, then it's time to invest in it. I have to create the product itself. I've decided what I'm going to do, now I have to actually make the thing. So in this metaphor, what that means is I have to learn the skills that are part of what I've decided I'm going to have as a software developer. I'll say software developer, but it can apply to any job you have. After you've done that, so you have a product, what's the next step? People have to buy the product, right? So then you have to market the product. And this is the part where people start feeling icky. And this is the part where the engineering mindset kicks in and the geek culture, depending on what side of the fence you're on, and you think, yuck, I don't want to do marketing. Marketing is gross, People should just understand quality and get it. I'll be good and people will then find me. But that's not true because nobody knows who you are, for one thing. But I'll go into more detail on this. So after you market the product, people are now paying for it. Then you have to execute. And if you're starting a company, this means operations. This means being more efficient. This means delivering on time, that sort of thing. And then finally, of course, any product that's just thrown out into the marketplace and stays as is going to have a kind of a short lifespan. So you have to iterate. And those are sort of the stages of developing a product in my oversimplified view, speaking as someone who's never actually developed a product or started a company. So I think of it as kind of an agile thing. And I tend to think in cycles anyway, just as a person. So if you look at it, research, invest, market, execute, and then iterate, that's something that you do for your entire career if you want to stay marketable or useful. So what I thought I would do is talk about each one of those in a little more detail. Have any of you read My Job Went to India? Part of it? A few people. Okay. So you'll recognize some of this stuff. But this is all sort of taken from the book, although frankly, I can't remember what's in the book. In fact, it's funny, in conversations with friends, My Job Went to India is really a collection of things that I always used to talk about at lunch, or wherever I happen to be with my colleagues. And now when I start telling stories, sometimes they say, yeah, I read that. So I can't remember what went in the book and what didn't. I think some of it will have not gone into the book. So starting with the research phase, this one's kind of interesting. If you were to start now, and really you are kind of starting now no matter where you are in your career, because you'll iterate, right? So if you were to start now, you have a few different choices to make. One is, and we'll just talk about software developers, what technologies am I going to focus on? What am I going to master? What am I going to have sort of cursory knowledge of? Am I going to get really deep into something, like know everything about web services or something horrible like that most people don't want to know about? Or am I going to have broad knowledge that lets me do something like architect big systems with complex interactions? It's kind of like looking at a market. So in fact, it is looking at a market, but it's looking at a job market. So if you look at the landscape right now, we have a bunch of software developers sitting in the Philippines, India, a lot more every day sitting in China for much less than people in India. You have to think about things like market saturation. So, for example, right now if I go to India and I want to hire somebody that does Java programming, and I'm paying okay, I can get thousands and thousands of resumes. And actually, it was better back in 2002 when we started our software development center. We put an ad in the newspaper, and we got 28,000 resumes back. 28,000 Java programmers replied and wanted a job. So we had to hire someone actually to help weed through all the resumes. So this tells me if I want to compete as a software developer, maybe Java is not a good thing to learn right now because there's a whole lot of competition. Not only that, the market in India and in Hungary and in China and the Philippines and all of these other low-cost destinations is commodity driven. A lot of business people will have you believe now that your skills are a commodity. Software development is just a commodity skill. You can pick and choose and replace people, and if one's cheaper than the other, then you get the cheaper one because you'll get the same amount done with that one person. But India, the idea that software developers are a commodity is not as offensive to the people there as it is here, because they've actually sort of created the market, and they do it really well, of doing commodity software development. So what you're doing, if you become a Java person, is you're putting yourself in the playing field with not just India. I'll talk about India because I know India really well. And I love India, by the way. If you read the book, you'll see that the title also kind of sounds like a little spiteful or hateful. But I actually, this is my I'm not a racist disclaimer that we had to actually do on the web. I speak Hindi and I listen to Indian music, and I'm a big sort of student of Indian culture. So you're basically making yourself a commodity by sticking yourself here as a Java programmer right now. Same would be true of .NET and other mainstream technologies like that. So we can kind of look at a similar situation from the business world. At the time that the iPod came out, several people have iPods here, I guess, right? Yeah? Everybody nods. I have 3 iPods. At the time that that came out, there were actually already MP3 players in the checkout line at Walmart. So like $15 for some crappy MP3 player, And there were, I don't even remember, the Diamond Rio and some other names that have fallen by the wayside now, but MP3 players were a commodity. The price was already, basically at the bottom. You had to sell a whole bunch of them to make any money. And then Apple comes out with the iPod, and I was thinking, and not just me, I'm not special, but I was thinking, okay, Steve Jobs has come to the company, and we all knew he was crazy, but now look what he's doing. They've always been this high-end thing, and they're creating an MP3 player in a saturated market that everyone's already losing money at. But the iPod has revolutionized Apple. So, I lied to you a minute ago because I told you I wouldn't become a Java programmer in a world of Java programmers, but Apple has sort of proven me wrong. It's okay to get into a commodity technology. It can be safe if you do it right, but you have to compete on a different plane. So Apple, I think, the best thing that they did first was they made the iPod really expensive. That was a way of saying, screw you people who think MP3 players are a commodity. This thing is awesome, and you're going to pay a lot for it. So that sort of piqued everybody's interest. But then they made the thing great. So they made every aspect of the experience, other than a few mistakes, like battery life and that kind of thing. They made every aspect of the experience, as Steve Jobs says, insanely great. And it has now taken over the market. It's stolen the market back from $15 a unit pieces of crap that are in the checkout lane, and they're charging hundreds of dollars, and smart people like me and you are paying hundreds of dollars for something that should cost $15. So this whole idea of looking at, what's a commodity versus not a commodity, what's hot versus not hot, it's not black and white. And that's why, it's not something where you can write a weblog post and everybody reads it and becomes successful. But the other thing is, when you're choosing technologies to potentially invest in, you might go for something bleeding edge. So I'm a living example of that. I will tell you now that I did it on purpose, even though that's a lie. But yeah, I intentionally started working in Ruby in the year 2000 because I could see that 5 years later it would make me a very marketable person. But nobody had heard of it, and people thought I was an idiot for using it at the time. I mean, not quite that harsh, but people would sort of laugh and snicker when I talked about maybe using Ruby at work, you know. And we actually have some scripts that are still running from the year 2000 at that company. But I went way out on the bleeding edge. So there's one thing about the bleeding edge. If you look at the way the offshore economies work, offshore as in offshore software development, they're looking for as many people as possible billing at once for as low a rate as they can handle. So this is the whole idea of high margin, low volume versus low margin, high volume, right? So the offshore model is high volume, low margin. Given the way that they've set up their entire businesses and processes, it doesn't make sense for them to ever look at a niche technology. It just doesn't make sense. And I'm talking about, you know, the companies that you may be contracting with to do your offshore work. Because they would have to develop whole new ways of selling to start doing Ruby programming now. They can't do it. They can't compete as Ruby developers unless they have new small businesses that start. But then, you know, it's really hard for them to reach out and take my job. So if you're on the bleeding edge, you're not going to have competition from the offshore world. The people that you will compete with are the few actual developers over there that are using these technologies and excited about them. And those people are frankly usually so good they get snapped up and they end up at Google in California or somewhere like that. So the other way you can do it, though, is you can look at, okay, if these companies are in the middle, they're catering to whatever is at the center of the bell curve right now, I can go back to the other end. So like, anyone do RPG programming? If you want to hire an RPG programmer in India, you have to pay just as much as you have to pay in the United States. And it'll take you just as long or longer to find them because nobody learns it. Why would they learn it if all the companies are hiring Java and .NET programmers? Is that me? No. So one of the things I talk about in the book, actually, is there is a career to be had if you can understand the the center of the bell curve technologies well enough, and you can move fast enough to follow these dying technologies, to kind of be like a hospice for dying technologies. Help people, you know, move from dying technology to future dying technology. And but you know, you have to think about in terms of what does the market want now, and not just now. There's going to be a period of time that you have to invest. So when I get to that phase, I've chosen a technology or whatever. Technology is sort of the easiest thing to talk about. Then I have to dig in and start learning it. Well, even if you're smart and you can learn it in a weekend, it's kind of hard to go out and then sell yourself as somebody who knows it because people want some experience. So it'll take you some time to really get any credentials in a new technology. So you need to think about what's going to be happening in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. Probably 5 is the best way to do it. You can't have a crystal ball, but the very fact that you're even considering it puts you ahead of most people who are just doing, you know, there are a lot of people who are sitting and programming in RPG, or I worked with a company recently that's using something called Fourth Dimension, and all of their programmers only know that. So they're actually moving to Rails, good for them. Not because Fourth Dimension is terrible and Rails is better, you know, I'm not into that kind of rah-rah stuff, but because these people only know Fourth Dimension. What happens if, you know, they want to leave that company? They're pretty much screwed, unless they have some flexibility. The thing is, though, if you know Fourth Dimension, you're over here, or, you know, if you're looking at me, you're over here on the bell curve. It's a technology that's not going to be around for very long. Almost nobody knows it. So you can probably kind of name your price if someone's desperate for a really good Fourth Dimension programmer. You also need to think about, I'm talking about technologies, but as you do this research thing, what industry do you want to be in? Software is not it. Maybe it is. Maybe you're going to make Norton antivirus or something like that. But if you really want to be valuable, back to the whole, how much do you cost or how much do you save your company, you have to understand the industry in which you work. And that sounds kind of obvious, but if you think about it, most people don't. Working at some of these big companies, I worked in revenue systems for a company. This was very early in my career. And I sort of understood how the revenue systems thing worked, but I had no idea how that plugged in business-wise to the rest of this company that was doing package delivery on a global level out of Memphis. But I knew sort of how the revenue systems thing worked. So I would go to meetings that were divisional meetings, and I would see all these PowerPoint charts and things, and I would think, well, what is this crap? I'm a programmer. I don't want to sit through this meeting. Don't they realize they're wasting my time? But if I reflect back to that time, I realized that never once did I have an idea that made it into that software. Not a significant idea. I did a lot of things like help automate builds and do all the kind of software generic practices that people do. But since then, in some of the jobs that I've enjoyed more and I've been rewarded better at, I actually had ideas because I understood the business that we were doing. We were creating and delivering appliances or service for appliances, that sort of thing. I dug in and I understood what the business processes were, where our IT systems sat in those business processes, and then understood as best as I could how the business leaders of those areas depended on our systems. What was it they were really trying to measure and improve? Because every business has something they're trying to improve. It ultimately ends up being the bottom line. And then, starting to think about our software problems in those terms, it becomes a lot less appealing to sit around and write some framework that is cool and fun, but really doesn't impact the business. What becomes appealing and exciting is quick hits, some of them dirty, that really help the business deliver value and therefore make money. So what I found very quickly in a previous job is that I'm not at all interested in the healthcare industry. I got into that, and I hated it. I hated every minute of it. And a lot of that was because I didn't care about the domain when it was actually health insurance. When it comes time for me to select health insurance when I get a new job, I just lock up because I don't understand it, and I don't care about it. I don't want to learn about it. It's boring. So it was a big mistake for me to go into a job where I was developing systems for a health insurance company. And that's the kind of thing you should think about. Also, what are the industries that are going to take off? Because health insurance is one of them, and I was kind of thinking in that way, so I say now, when I made the mistake and took this job that I hated. But health insurance is getting bigger and bigger, and all this sort of electronic stuff and automation around it is getting bigger and bigger. That would actually be a good industry to invest knowledge in now. And if you need to get a job and you have really good IT stuff in your portfolio, but you have an understanding of how, say, medical claims are handled in the industry, it's all of a sudden you're a very hot commodity on the software market if you're willing to get a job that deals with health insurance. So think about the industry that you're going to go into and support through your software. I'm talking way too long. So after you go through this research phase, you get to the part where it's about investing. And investing means, okay, I've chosen to be a Ruby programmer. Now I have to learn Ruby. Not only that, but I have to be someone who is generally smart as a software developer. I need to make time to continuously improve. And I think this is the kind of thing that's it doesn't take long to explain. It's obvious what that means, but how do you keep doing it day in and day out? Most of us get caught up in our daily work. We do that, then we go home and we watch television or play video games if you're me. And it's too easy to lose sight of learning. So what I have done in the past is I've actually set aside times that I do it. Sometimes it's 5 minutes. Say it's the 5 minutes before you leave for work every day. You learn something new. You have some topic. You learn something about that topic every morning. But the point is, you have to set aside time, and it has to be something that gets on your schedule, or else it's going to get thrown off of your schedule. One thing that you'll notice, and that I have to tell myself a lot, is if you ever have to take a sick day, the company that you work for doesn't fall apart, and neither does your work, usually. You take the sick day, and then you come back the next day, and everything's okay. This is proof that a day can go by where you don't work directly on whatever that sort of day in, day out grind is that you've got going. A day can go by where you can just learn something, for example. So what I did at this big company that I worked for was actually help to institute times that it was sort of expected that people would spend, from 10 o'clock Friday morning to the rest of the day, not really working on their thing, but trying to come up with something new that no one had ever done before. And I know Google does that in a much more formal, kind of extreme way. But it's a good example of the sort of thing or process you can put in place to internalize this and to make sure it doesn't fall off the schedule. Also, as you're doing this kind of investment in yourself as a product, you can't forget things like methodologies and that sort of thing. So you're all here at this XP meeting. You probably know a little bit about extreme programming, and that's a good thing. That's something special that the extreme programming world has made happen. It's made fans of methodology, where methodology used to be this really uninteresting thing that no one really cared about except for methodologists. Now it's made everyone an armchair methodologist. We have meetings like this and people discuss the finer points of project management. That's really funny for software developers to do. But there are other methodologies, other sort of orthogonal methodologies that you can think about. For example, at this company, I was a Six Sigma black belt. So, yeah, some people are snickering. People who know about Six Sigma are snickering, but Six Sigma is a quality management methodology that is almost always horribly abused. And most people in the software world, at least the ones that know better, actually laugh when I tell them that I was a Six Sigma black belt because they can't believe it. It totally doesn't fit my personality. It doesn't fit the agile world, at least the way that it's normally cast. But as it turns out, being a Six Sigma black belt has changed the way I think about everything since, in a very positive way. I don't actually ever do Six Sigma. Six Sigma is very statistics driven. But if I were doing an XP project, I would be using the design for Six Sigma methodology, sort of meta on top of that to make the process good. Think about this sort of thing, these little methodologies. Maybe it's like lean manufacturing or something that you don't even see how could apply. That's an investment that you can make in yourself. It can not only change the way that you're working day to day, but sort of change the way you arrive at what you should learn next, change the way you arrive at decisions on the work that you're doing, and so on and so on. I mentioned Six Sigma because as agile people, Six Sigma is icky. So if you go read about it, you'll be disgusted if you're here for extreme programming. But I think it's a really good practice as you start to invest in yourself and you start to learn new things, to learn things that make you sick, that are anti-whatever you are, that are heretical even. So, if you're always making fun of waterfall processes, start learning about how to do waterfall right. See if you could figure that out. If you're totally against waterfall and you make fun of it and you all laugh at the water fountain about it, really take a week and think hard and write something or whatever, read a bunch about how to do waterfall right. If you're an object-oriented programmer, start looking at a functional programming language. Because most of us think we're branching out. We say, well, I know Java and Ruby, or Java and C# or whatever. Those are so close to each other, you might not even know it until you try to use Erlang. Java, C, C#, probably most of the languages that we all actually use for our daily work are so close to each other that they don't bend our kind of realm of how to solve programming problems. So I used to tell my Java friends that Ruby has had the biggest effect on my Java programming of anything I've tried to improve my Java programming. Because it's so different. When I look at a problem in Java, I think about the elegant Ruby solution. Then I get frustrated, and then I come up with something that's almost as good as the Ruby solution. The same is true now. I'm playing with Erlang and OCaml, languages like that. When I'm doing Ruby, I think, man, if it was Erlang, it would be so much easier. Because Erlang makes massively concurrent programming really easy. So when you have a problem that is in that space, you start to look in whatever language you're using at how that other radically different thing would be. So we all, even those of us that think we're really open-minded, we fall into the trap of being really myopic about technologies, methodologies that we use, especially if you're on the fringe. And I know XP probably isn't so much on the fringe now, but I bet a bunch of you started doing it when it was, and when you had to really fight for it. And now some of you still have to really fight to make it happen because people don't get it or they're scared of it or whatever. Because you have to fight so hard, you're zealous, and you think it's right, but it might not be. There might be a better way to do it. And so exploring will make you more pragmatic and well-rounded. As a musician, I told you I'm either a jazz saxophonist, a classical composer, or a punk rock guitarist. But each one is made better by the other. Some of you may not believe that the punk rock thing helps, but it really does. So you've created this brilliant product, which is yourself, at least in the realm of what you do for your job. And now you want to actually put that to work. This is where you have to learn to market yourself. And for those of you who are aware of or even embroiled in the geek culture, which is perpetuated by sites like Slashdot, communities like the Perl community, the idea of marketing and being Perl community or Slashdot? Oh, good, because Slashdot would be embarrassing to be excited about.
But its home is right here.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's cool.
They're both from Holland. Half an hour south.
They're not here, are they? No. If you're in one of those cultures, and there are many like it, the idea of marketing yourself is seen, there's kind of this badge of honor that geeks have about being geeky and being the dork that sits in the back and can't hardly communicate and nobody wants to talk to and doesn't understand the business, and is maybe even scary, like you've seen the system administrator from hell or whatever kind of stuff. People enjoy that image, and it's sort of burned into the culture of being a computer hacker in the old sense of the word. And it's a very, very negative thing. I think it's largely responsible for any of the downfall of the American programmer that is actually happening is coming in no insignificant part because of this part of our culture as software developers. It's moronic to think that just being good is good enough. I might make the best tea in the world, but none of you have ever had it. So if I start selling it at my house, there's no way that any of you would buy it, or worse, you would never tell anyone to buy it. And that's what I need, right? So if you think about it, if you create a good product and you think it's really good, and let's just think about it in terms of some abstract thing, it's a product that saves people money. I don't tell people about it. What I'm doing is robbing every possible customer of the opportunity to save that money. So in a way, I'm stealing people's money by not marketing this thing to them. Not stealing it, but just robbing them of the opportunity to have money. So marketing then becomes, if you have a great product, it becomes something that you should feel morally obligated to do, as opposed to the opposite, where most of us feel dirty if we promote ourselves. You shouldn't promote something that's bad. So if you have something that sucks and you try to sell it to someone and tell them it's great, that's bad. But if you've developed something great, you should feel morally obligated to tell people about it. So how do you do that as a software developer? How do you market yourself? Well, one way is, you can think sort of in two ways. One is internal to your company. So you work in a company, you have some skill that you think would be valuable. You have to make sure people know about that skill. That can actually be having a conversation with your boss or your boss's boss about something that you do. And it doesn't have to be the kind of ugly thing, hey, look at me, I'm great. But just sparking conversations, inviting people to lunch, letting them know you exist, but then also letting them know what you're capable of. Because if they don't know what you're capable of, they won't make use of it, and therefore you're robbing your company of money. Even though when they're paying you to be your best, you're not letting them use you to your fullest potential. But then also thinking outside of wherever you work. Think about the industry. So maybe you write something on a weblog. Maybe you write an article for a magazine. Maybe you write a book. Or you sign up to speak at events like this, your user group. You will help people as you do it because you're hopefully giving them something valuable. At the same time, you make yourself known and you create a market for yourself, the product that is you. So I mentioned things like writing a book and an article for a magazine. As I told you, I'm not special, but I've written 2 books myself and co-written several and edited several. I've written magazine articles and keynoted at conferences. But there's one thing that made that possible. The one thing is I proposed that I should do those things to whoever publishes them. So I said, hey, let me write an article for your magazine. And you'd be surprised if you do that and you sound coherent. The people who you ask will say, yes, please, thank you. Hey, let me write a book for you. If you're coherent, again, that would be great. Because most people who sign up to write books actually don't write the book. They start writing it and then they stop because they realize how hard it is. But I think probably most of you in this room could actually put together a book proposal and send it to the publisher that I work for and have it be accepted. I would say that most of you in the room probably would never actually write the book, but that's just statistics. It's not a slight against you. But my point here is, once you write the book or the magazine article, then, say it's a magazine article, then you stop having to ask to write the book. People start asking you, will you write a book? Or they start asking you, will you speak at the conference? Then you go to the conference, someone hears you there and says, will you write a book? Because you're obviously an expert because you wrote a book. That's kind of funny. When I got into Rails, I actually said, well, I have to do Rails professionally now. I'd played with it a little bit, but now that I have to do it professionally, I should write a book about it so I can learn it. So I wrote Rails recipes for that reason. I was a Ruby programmer, but not a Rails person. I hadn't been doing web development at my job, so I didn't care about Rails. So I said, well, I'll write a book about it and learn it. And now I'm like one of the leading experts in Rails. Now I actually had to become an expert in Rails. I'm joking when I say I'm one of the leading experts in Rails, but I'm seen as being one of them. Also, I organized this conference, the International Rails Conference. We did the first one last year. And here's the binder for it. It's very impressive. I wrote my notes on it for this. We did the first one in Chicago last year, and at least one of you was there, right? Who was at RailsConf other than Brian there? 4. Yeah, cool. So now that I've organized this conference, I'm even seen more as some sort of industry guru about Rails. But the truth is, organizing a conference is about doing stuff like deciding what's going to be on the menu for lunch. It's not Rails, but people now think I'm an expert in Rails. Now, I happen to also be really good at Rails, but not because of the conference. So these are all things that you can do to market yourself. Now, part of marketing that I think is important to mention is that, I'll give you a musical example. There are some musicians that I think are like all about marketing and none about substance. And that makes me sick, you know. And so like when I was in high school, I used to go to the music stores and I would grab the entire Kenny G section and I would move it from jazz to easy listening. And this was something that I did on a regular basis, wherever I happened to be. So I've since had a realization about Kenny G though. Like Kenny G, I opened for Kenny G once actually in a concert, and we played Kenny G songs in like the style of heavy metal. But Kenny G, the one thing that he does that everybody remembers after a concert, because most people don't actually get it, you know, is he holds a note for a long time. And he can do this thing called circular breathing, which has no like artistic merit, but it's a trick where you can inhale and blow out at the same time so you can play a never-ending note. He does that, and after about 15 seconds, everybody starts clapping in the audience and screaming and jumping up and down. He's just holding a note, you know, like so. If you had a Casio keyboard, you could do that with. So the question is, like, I played free jazz, and free jazz is where the band just starts playing, and they improvise, and it's all about these subtle interactions. You're basically composing on the spot. But it tends to sound pretty dissonant and hard to hear as an untrained listener because you make use of strange choral variations. Of course, you haven't planned anything, so sometimes you make bad sounds accidentally. Sometimes you make them intentionally. But it requires a lot of skill to become really good at freely improvising music as a group. But most people didn't like that. We actually tried that before the Kenny G concert, you know. We didn't think they would like it. We really were just sort of protesting and getting paid for it. But I've since, now that I'm old, I've since realized that, I'm not really that old, but I've since realized that maybe Kenny G has something right and I was wrong all these years. Because if everybody likes what he does, and nobody liked what I did, but mine was like musically superior in some weird way, which one was actually better? So an argument could be made that Kenny G's music is actually better than most jazz musicians because it actually provides some benefit to the listeners, and it provides benefit to a lot of listeners, and it only hurts a few of us. So, you know, think about that in terms of your software. A lot of times we think that, you know, our brilliant design is the best thing, and some crappy access database is an abomination. But if users love the access database and they don't love your J2EE thing, and they don't realize they need the scalability or they don't even need it, then the access database is actually better than your big scalable thing. Sort of a heretical thing to say, you know, but so marketing is not just about promoting yourself, but it's about connecting with your users. And this means marketing you, right? It's about connecting your users and being the bridge between what they actually like and the thing that you do that's also supposed to be of high quality. Now, as a craftsperson or an artisan of software, hopefully what you're developing is elegant and wonderful in its own right. But your job in this sort of, this marketing role is to make sure that the users know that you're there. User meaning whoever your customer is. If you work in a company, it might actually be end users of your software. So they know you're there. They can connect with you. This is part of not being the grunting geek in the back. They can connect with you, and they can understand that you're there to meet their needs and not to have fun programming. So you've marketed and you've got yourself in place now. Now it's time to actually execute. So, you know, you have a job. I won't belabor this too much, mostly because I talked too long earlier. I think probably one of the worst anti-examples of execution that I've seen and been guilty of myself is, and it's counterintuitive, the smartest guy on the team, or girl on the team, whoever it is, may actually be one of the lamest executors on the team. I don't know if you've worked in environments like this. The person truly is the best when you think about it in terms of software development, potential, understanding, knowledge, designability, everything else. But they're too embroiled in the fact that they're the best, and they're too confident in the fact that they're smarter than everyone else, or the feeling that they're smarter than everyone else. But it's actually the bulldog on the team that barely gets it, but gets it just enough that out-executes everybody. If you've been a manager of a software development team, you're probably thinking about the bulldog because you've seen this more than one time. When I was a young manager, this surprised the heck out of me because I thought, here's the guy who's not going to make it because I'm on this elite software architect team, Here's the guy we're going to let him try. He'll try his best, and then we'll put him somewhere else. That guy rises to the top because he's trying so hard to compensate for the fact that he knows all these other brilliant people around him might outperform him, might outclass him. He ends up standing head and shoulders above everybody else. So in the same way that if you're in one of these fringe groups where you know you're doing the best thing, you're kind of at risk. If you're the smartest person, you're also at risk. You're at risk of not executing because you become disillusioned and you sit at your desk and you think, well, I can program this thing 5 times faster than these other people. So what you end up doing is browsing the web instead of working. And you actually, in fact, are not the best. Being the smartest and being the best aren't the same thing. And that kind of goes back to the Kenny G argument as well. If someone does something poorly that meets a user's needs, poorly, but they do it poorly and on time, and the user is happy, you do something really, really well, but not very much of it, and it maybe doesn't quite meet the user's needs, what you've done is not as good as the cobbled together junk that somebody else did. So an example of execution, another one, you think about, like you maybe have a favorite local coffee shop or something like that where you hate Starbucks, but you love this thing, and there's all these people that have this anti-Starbucks thing going. You have to pick them out when you first meet them so that you can embarrass them. But maybe it's not a Starbucks, or maybe it's not a coffee shop, maybe it's a local hardware store. There are all these little businesses throughout the United States that are still flourishing, even though Lowe's is next door with everything you might ever want at a lower cost. And the reason is there's this personalized service that you get. They remember you every time. They know about that project you were doing on your basement, and they ask you how'd that tool work out, or they might even stop by after work and look at your thing. Or they remember what coffee you like to drink, and they prepare it like that every time, or they remember you're allergic to such and such. But there's all these reasons that we love local business. And as a culture, we demonize Walmart and Starbucks and anything that gets big and homogenized. And there are good reasons for that, right? But sometimes it doesn't work very well. And one of the worst ways that you can fail as a local business is if you fail to execute. Because the marketing is going to happen for you. And typically the investment in one of those local businesses kind of comes over time. The very fact that you're still alive means you've made it. So think about that as a software developer. One, how can you be like that local business? So the local business is fighting against commoditization and globalization, but it's still succeeding. How can you be like that? What are the qualities of the local coffee store that keep it in business even when there's a Starbucks on opposing corners on the next street? And how does that apply to you as a software developer? How can you have that same kind of personal touch, or whatever it is? I don't even know what all the qualities are. So that's one angle that you can save yourself, not only from being flooded or drowned in the sea of commoditization, but sort of reach to the top of whatever organization you happen to be in, is thinking about those local businesses that still survive in the face of adversity, of globalization. But there's actually one in Louisville. It's like this, and some people feel that it's great. It's called MacTown. And so Mactown is a place where you buy Apple equipment and you have your Apple equipment serviced and that sort of thing. And they're the local business. So there was an Apple store that was opening in the city, but I needed my computer fixed. So I said, I'm going to go to Mactown because they're the local business and I bet they're going to be great, you know. And I dropped off my laptop and I used that, you know, to make a living, right? So I drop off my laptop and they don't tell me when it's going to come out, when it's going to be fixed. And then I call back 3 days later, not having heard anything, and I say, hey, what's up with my laptop? There was a problem with the hard drive. And they start getting angry that I've called and asked. And I continue to call back, and I continue to call back. They never call me back. They say they're going to have it finished. They don't have it finished, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, at the end of this, I would rather go to this massive faceless thing like an Apple store or a CompUSA. In fact, CompUSA, I think, is where I went. I would rather deal with CompUSA because it's like a robot facelessly taking my thing from me, spitting out a time in this really, you know, in a manner devoid of personality that it's going to be ready, and then returning it, and it probably works. Then go to the local business where they fail to execute, and they act like jerks. I really only talk about Mactown because we're and I'm hoping people will see this and not go to Mactown. So,
Kenny G's going to be after you too.
actually, if Kenny G is going to go after anyone, it's going to be Pat Metheny. Google for Pat Metheny, Kenny G, and you will read some really profane stuff. Pat Metheny's a guitarist. You saw them what? Oh, really? I would love to see that. Song X. They did an album together. Anyway, we can talk about that on the break. So you do all this stuff, and because you're agile thinkers, then of course, I've described this as if it's this big, long career. But really, as an agile thinker, then you'll take all of this stuff that I've just described and you'll condense it and you'll say, okay, that's a 1-week iteration, right? So think about your career in iterations. You know, if you're into XP, and you probably are, is there anyone here that's here because they like to heckle the XP people, or, you know, I don't know. So you're probably into XP. You don't like big design up front. You even have an acronym for it that is not even pronounceable. I don't know, do you say BDUF or something? BUFD? Oh, big upfront design? All right. So you don't like big upfront design, but most of us take that approach with our careers. We think we're on some track. You know, you crystallize it in college, and then you just go until the end, and then you look back and say, well, we didn't quite get the requirements right. So I think I'm a pretty good example of that. Not, you know, I'm showing that you don't have to think of your career that way. And I know a lot of people like me that, you know, the guy who helped me rewrite this system in Rails that I just did for the past year, Bruce Williams, one of the best Ruby programmers around, one of the best designers. He designed the Rails conf logos and Ruby conf t-shirts and all that. He actually worked professionally as an Arabic linguist. And you know, most of the best programmers I know were musicians or linguists or historians or something like that, because they iterate. And I'm hoping that within the next 8 to 10 years, I will be a psychologist or something else, something that's, you know, not programming. Because I believe that I learn things with each iteration of my career. I can then make improvements. And I can be agile enough to realize that, you know, there's this heresy that it even sounds wrong to me. I'm a programmer, so I should continue to be a programmer. So to say that maybe I should be a lawyer, that sounds crazy, you know? But maybe I should be a lawyer. Or maybe I should, I don't know, write greeting cards or something. But that's the kind of heretical thinking that opens your mind up to the actual possibilities that are probably not quite as weird as writing greeting cards or being a lawyer. So I think of my career not in 1-week iterations, but I think Bill Gates said, if you don't have something substantial and new to put on your resume every 6 months, you're in the wrong line of work. Think of it that way. Maybe it's a half-year assessment. But go back and don't just reassess your career in terms of where you are and what technologies you're using and all that, but look at whatever your base assumptions are. So a base assumption might be, for me, here I am traveling around talking, writing books and all this stuff. I'm pretty much solidly a software developer, so it seems, or someone who's in that industry. And I've spent all this time working up my position in this industry so that I can do the things I want to do. But that is an assumption that I should question every time I have an iteration. Like, am I in the right industry? Because it's the same kind of assumption that made me leave big corporate America. Before that, I had thought I wanted to be a CIO, or maybe even really get into the business end of things and be a CEO of a small business someday, that sort of thing. And it was in one of these kind of reflective, heretical times when I said, maybe working within the confines of a business is too limiting for me. Maybe I should be thinking about CEO or that rung of the ladder of my industry, not of the company that I worked for. And if it hadn't been for the ability to question base assumptions, one of them being a steady job with really good pay and great benefits with lots of upward mobility is a good thing. That's the assumption I had. And I realized that for me, that was a bad assumption. It worked during the beginning of my career, but it made me increasingly unhappy later on. And eventually, I probably would have burned out and really stopped exceeding or excelling in my career as a result. So as you iterate, question those base assumptions. And think of your career, if you've read The Pragmatic Programmer, you've heard the term tracer bullets as they use it. Ready, fire, aim. That's the way you want to do it. Because just as in agile software development, the cost of change is so little. If you're always kind of reworking who you are, the cost of change is quite small if you do it in small enough steps. So shoot and see what happens. And maybe shooting means, go speak at a conference or position yourself to be expert in the Befunge programming language and see where that goes, Maybe don't invest too much in it because you may have wasted your time, but you're doing it on your off time anyway. So what do you lose other than some of your free time? You probably kind of make yourself smarter. I did it with Ruby, and that was an obvious cheating success story because I got lucky. But there are other technologies. Maybe it's, where did these Rails people go when they realized that Rails is boring and not really that big a deal? Do they start doing small talk and seaside development? Maybe. I might actually bet on that a little bit. Or maybe the computer science-y stuff in Ruby that starts leaking into the mainstream from where it used to be an MIT only. Maybe that stuff opens the minds of the greater software industry to getting into stuff like, maybe we should use Scheme or OCaml or Erlang on our next project for a business application. You could make that kind of bet. Maybe one of those things is going to pop. But the idea is you can make little investments in these things and see if they seem to pay off, see if they gain any traction. And you're not killing yourself or your career by doing it. So basically, just to reiterate, you think about your career in terms of a product. You think about how you would build a product if you started your own company and you had everything on the line. Because you sort of have, in a metaphorical sense, and you sort of do have everything on the line. Everything is riding on it professionally. And really be intentional in the way you build your career. And like I said, just being here and thinking about this puts you ahead of everybody else. But don't aim to not lose. Aim to win, and you will.
Questions? Anybody want to keep going?
What are your thoughts on Ajax?
My thoughts on Ajax. So specifically,
Is something to put your time into?
okay. If you're doing web application development now, I don't think you have a choice. You have to learn about how doing all the cool stuff with it. But it adds a new layer that you didn't have to worry about before. It was that whole JavaScript file manipulation thing that most of us thought was dirty and evil. You could get away with not doing because it was supposed to be ugly and not used. But now I think web developer is it's not a differentiator, that's for sure. At least in the leading edge segment of the web development market. So if you want to be a web developer and compete, you have to understand how it works. And you have to master at least one way of doing it. Whether that be like the prototype scriptaculous stack, or I don't know if anyone's using Dojo anymore, or Moki Kit, or the various layers that sit on top of what the browser provides. I think you have no choice. I'll stand up.
Our application is being converted to Ajax. I work on the back end, so I don't get involved in the work on that. So.
Well, that's also sort of another point that if you work on the back end of an app, I think it really behooves you to understand the entire end-to-end flow, even if you never have to touch it. Because, especially the points where the interactions happen, but getting the architecture will set you apart from the other people who just hack their modules and call it a day. So I had a question that was asked a couple of times, answered just in the spirit of lightening things up a little bit. Some people have seen me at various conferences or pictures of me on the web, and I always look different, like totally radically different. So if you met me in 2005, I had no hair, and I had like a small goatee, and now I look like Grizzly Adams. And the reason for that, in case you're interested, or even if you're not, it's a good cause. I'm growing my hair for this charity called Locks of Love, where you donate your hair to children who have cancer and go through chemotherapy and lose it. So I thought, I don't work for a big company anymore, so who cares? If nobody cares what my hair looks like, I'll just let it grow and it's free. There sure is a pain, actually. It's really uncomfortable. But look at locksoflove.org. Donate your hair if you have the ability. So other serious questions?
Or not so serious.
Or not so serious? Yeah.
You mentioned Erlang and OCaml programming languages. What drives your interest in functional languages?
So what drives my interest in functional languages? I'd say the number one thing is the fact that they make me uncomfortable. When I look at a problem, I can't think of a way, in many cases, to solve it with Haskell or OCaml or whatever. Like I have no idea. And what that tells me is there's an entire segment of computer science, or I shouldn't say computer science because that sounds too nerdy, too academic, but of the possibilities of software development and of expression through software that I don't get at all, which means that I'm missing something from the toolbox that I've built in my head. And there are ways, I've seen them now, especially through Ruby, there are ways to apply the functional way of thinking that are much, much more clean than dividing things up into a bunch of nouns that interact via verbs, which you do in object-oriented programming. Or, procedural programming, of course, which is sort of poor man's object-oriented programming, just calling, sending messages to outer space and getting responses. You find when you try to use Haskell for the first time that you can't parse a string. You can't split a string into chunks. You can't iterate through a list of things and do something with it like you could in Java or whatever you use. And the reason is not that the language won't do it, but that you can't wrap your head around how you would accomplish it in the language. So then you go out and you start finding out, well, how would people do that? Bend your brain. That's actually the same reason that I got into stuff like obfuscated programming languages, like defunge. Has anyone seen it defunge? One person? Two people? Defunge, you shouldn't expect that you know defunge, but defunge is a thing where you have to think in terms of two-dimensional space, and you're actually visually sort of following a character pointer through your program. So it's a mental workout. To even print hello world in defunge is really, really hard, but it makes you smarter as you start trying to do it. And I can't say that I've ever practically applied anything I learned in the bunch, but I know that it made me think about problems differently. So I try to look for new paradigms, and there aren't many popular ones left to look at. You know, there's prototype-based programming and functional programming, object orientation, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're going to learn a new language, sort of this self-improvement thing, I would recommend, unless you have a real need, like you're a Java programmer, you have to do a project in C#, learn C#. Otherwise, do not learn C#, because it's really just Java++. It won't change the way you think. Learn something that hurts your brain. Learn COBOL or RPG or one of those, or Ada, because it'll change the way you approach problems, or at least it'll make you glad where you work.
Yeah, how much time do you devote towards marketing yourself?
How much time do I devote toward marketing myself? That's hard to quantify. I'm a big fan of a guy named Seth Godin, who writes books about marketing for marketers. And I've read, I think, all of his books. If you haven't seen, you can go to sethgodin.com and subscribe to his weblog. It's wonderful, accessible stuff about marketing. But he has kind of a radical view that the most important thing about marketing is product development. And there is no separation, and there should be no separation. So I'm not saying that I've taken his advice and crafted my career that way, but I don't really make decisions about anything I do that aren't somehow affected by the marketing aspect of it. I very rarely spend a solid minute of time that's only about marketing myself, though. I mean, if you think about it, being here, seeing a bunch of people, many of whom didn't know who I was until my name was on the website, that's marketing. But I didn't come here for that reason. I really just came here because I like to talk about this kind of stuff and meet people. But of course, that was, part of it. So probably zero time on only marketing, but I try to weave it into everything I do. Kind of like when you say, like, how much time do you who do test-driven development spend writing your tests? It's hard to say because writing your tests is how you develop your software. So it's not even fair to separate them and count some of the time to testing. You wouldn't in your time tracking application say 30 seconds on testing, now I ran the test and then it failed, so now 5 seconds on implementation or whatever. I think of it that way. Yes?
When you write a book, how many hours do you spend on it?
How many hours do I spend on my book? It's interesting. Dave Thomas, we did this Rails Edge conference last week or 2 weeks ago where it was a bunch of Rails people talking about Rails stuff, and Dave did a lightning talk. He's the owner, or one of the owners of the publishing company that did the book and wrote Pragmatic Programmer and Agile Web Development with Rails. And Dave did a little lightning talk on how to write a book. And he said that authors spend, for even a fairly small software development book, expect to spend 700 hours on the book. So that was the number he came up with from himself and talking to other people in the industry. I don't know how much time I spend, but I would guess that it's less than half of what he said. Probably a quarter of that time. So,
But are you counting rewrites and stuff like that?
I don't do rewrites. And that's another thing. He said expect to throw away the first 50 pages. And I'm not saying this is a good thing, but I don't revise my work. I just write it and then that's it. Unless someone makes me revise it, which happens sometimes. But so usually, I've always had a full-time job when I wrote a book, which I don't recommend. And I typically would work Friday night through Sunday for a few months. But what I do is I'll work Friday night through Sunday night. I sleep, of course, during that time. And then 3 weeks will go by and I won't do anything. And then I do it again, maybe 2 weeks in a row. And I do some stuff in the mornings and the evenings during the week. And then another 3 or 4 weeks go by and I don't do anything. And I do that for about 4.5 to 5 months and I'm finished. So I don't know if I can count up the hours, but that's how long I spend. So what I'm saying is I think there's a lot of variation depending on who you are and how you write, but it's very time consuming regardless. It's also emotionally draining and stressful, and all these other bad things, and then, of course, very rewarding. Yeah.
Well, you had your full-time job and writing a book. Did you have wife, children, social life?
Life, yes. Social life, never really had much of one anyway. But yeah, I did things like practice the guitar, or waste time on video games, or watch way too much TV. So the things that I would have done if I had children, or I wouldn't have done if I had children or a social life, and yeah, somehow I managed to do that. But yeah, I made myself really tired. I did it for 2 years straight, because I wrote 2 books back to back. But it's an interesting question, because the answer you expected was no, or all of those things suffer or whatever, right? But they don't actually have to suffer. The thing that you really have to do, not just for writing a book, like writing a weblog that you want people to start reading so they know who you are, for example, or so you share their insights and kind of learn as part of the community. If you do it for 20 minutes a day, that's enough. Writing a book 20 minutes a day, if you do it every day, is enough to really get momentum and write a good book. Because you'll end up saying, oh, I'm on a roll, I'm going to write for 4 hours on Saturday and feel good about it. It's not like work when you do it that way. If you plan on 20 or 30 minutes. So I actually got a lot of criticism when some vocal criticism when I wrote My Job Went to India, because people read it and said, this guy's crazy, you can't do all this stuff. Because there's not enough hours in the day, and don't want to have life and all that. Of course, you're not going to do all this stuff, so that's part of it. I don't expect anyone to read the book and do every single thing, or to listen to me speak and do every single thing. But I think it's possible to do enough of them, and to, kind of like the agile practices, you do the right ones in the right combination, and you think about them right, you get the gist, you're going to get the benefit. And that's the way I think of it. So I think it's possible to have a very busy schedule. I also left out the fact that I was director of 2 nonprofits and ran this whole Tibetan refugee organization at the same time that I was doing this stuff as well, because that wasn't relevant. But I did a lot more than just those things, and felt quite stressed out, but not on the verge of suicide. So if you had a full-time job and a wife and kids, you could probably write a book pretty comfortably if you manage your time correctly. There's this crazy guy named Steve Pavlina, and he has a fairly popular weblog. It's not as popular anymore, but he does all these articles on time management, or he used to, and now he talks about telepathy. But when he was doing time management, he did this very influential on me thing on time management, where he just said, work for 30 minutes at a time. Plan to work for 30 minutes and then reward yourself. And this is really kind of a good thing for any extra work you do. You can go to work and do your job. People don't usually have trouble doing that. But the extra thing that gets you to the next level, just do it for 30 minutes, and then feel good that you did it for 30, because it's easy to do something for 30 minutes. And then let yourself feel good that you did that. Then see what happens. Do that once a day and you'll go a long way. Other questions?
I haven't read it, but I've been kind of overexposed, I think, lately to The World is Flat. I wonder if you've read it, if you have any thoughts on it.
I haven't.
The body of criticism of it.
I haven't. I actually, that came out right at the end of the time that I was writing my book. And having lived in India, I tried to read it, it was just horribly boring, because it was so obvious. Everything in it was so obvious. And he starts the book actually with a scene on a golf course that I used to go to when I play golf in Bangalore. And it was kind of the same, thing about realizing this whole thing through interactions with people and being in these places. So no, I find the whole thing to be just kind of like reading my own book. It's not very interesting. Not to say that mine is as good as his, but I sort of lived through it. I also wouldn't read a new book on rails, because it's just like, not interesting anymore. Yeah. Yes.
What were some of the things that you learned in going through thousands of interviews when you were in India?
So, the first one was the things that motivate me as a programmer don't motivate most people in India. in America, and this was like a total misconception that I had. In America, like us, we're here because we're excited about software development, you know. Most of my friends who are programmers are excited about it. We chat about it online, we see each other, we stay up late coding, you know. We see our jobs as a fun place to go, and we value our jobs in terms of course, how much we make, but more importantly, how rewarding the job is. In India, you're talking about people who are like 1 or 2 generations away from, or maybe 0 generations away from living in a village with no running water. So, with a background like that, you know, in a situation where you're in a village farming with no running water, a tiny little thing can change or go wrong, and your family can be ruined. You know, a tsunami, for example, can just wipe you out. Even if you're not there to be actually killed by the tsunami, I mean, you're faced with like perilous issues that affect the well-being, potentially affect the well-being of you or your family. So your motivation toward your job in that economic environment, almost regardless of who you are, is not about what's the most rewarding job I can have. It's about how can I make a lot of money so that I can buy a house that all of my family can live in and be comfortable and happy. And then how can I make sure that my children are better educated than me? And it sounds like, you know, hokey for me to say that, but that literally is what's going through the minds of all of these programmers. So I'm in Bangalore, which is India's Silicon Valley, coming from Louisville, Kentucky, where it's really not a hotbed of innovation. You know, there's some cool stuff going on, but it's hard to find people to chat with and, you know, interact with that were interested in agile development or Ruby or, you know, some of the other stuff that I was into. When I went to India, I was very surprised that there were no user groups, there was no discussion, there was no buzz. It was basically just companies doing work and people getting jobs at them and going home. That was it. And so what I learned is that this economic difference makes people interested in getting their being a tester thing over with so they can be a programmer, so they can be a developer and then an architect and then a project manager and then a manager as fast as possible so they can make money, have a stable job, have a good title for things like arranged marriages, that sort of thing. And it was all about really more practical, bare bones needs. And therefore, there was also the issue that most Indian people at that time that were in the software industry didn't have a computer of their own. So if you work in an environment where your computer's locked down, you actually have to be given the opportunity to learn something by your company, or you can't install it and use it and try it. I couldn't imagine that. You know, if that were the case for me, I would have just been a musician and not a software developer, because that's just not a good environment. So I went to India thinking that all people are the same, you know, this very kind of hippie-ish thing of, I'm not a hippie, I just look like one today, this kind of hippie-ish thing of, you know, all people are equal and the same, and so now I believe that they're equal in terms of equality, but the specifics of cultures can very drastically differ, and it can affect, you know, every level of interaction you have with someone. That was a really surprising thing to me. So I was expecting to find all kinds of awesome programmers, and frankly, the programmers in India are not as good as the programmers here, on average. They're just not. And I say that being someone who loves the culture and really try to promote offshoring, but they're not, and there's a good reason for it, and it's the economic drivers.
When you're looking to learn a new technology, right, what would you say the payoff is in terms of marketing and growing yourself for learning something that's way out of the edge versus learning something that would be really useful inside your organization? Say the difference between learning Haskell and becoming an Oracle guru.
I think you actually have to make time for both of those things. So you actually said, you asked two questions at the same time in a way, because you said marketing and growing yourself. And Haskell is going to probably have a much bigger impact on you over the long term, actually change the way you think and make you better. Just like as a musician, I think I use this example in the book, but as a musician, when you practice, if you practice things you already know how to play, you don't get any better. If you sound good when you practice, it means you're doing the wrong thing, because you're playing things that already sound good when you play them. Same is true with technology. If you learn something that's like what you've already done, it's comfortable, and you're already kind of good at it when you start learning it, it's not going to make you grow. So Haskell is better for that, probably, unless you're already a Haskell programmer. But I think you have to do both. The good news is to become kind of an Oracle guru, if you're already touching Oracle, it's probably easy to pick that up because it doesn't make you stretch your brain as much. So when I say easy, I mean easier than Haskell. So you can spend the same small amount of time on the two and learn a lot that will directly help you in your company, but also keep this thing going that makes you smarter and smarter. And then, of course, with something like Haskell, you probably don't have a need for it, so you can just play with it for an afternoon and then throw it aside, if it has had some effect on you. Try something else next. I did a lot of that, especially early on with new languages. Just try a bunch of different things.
What kind of things do you think an employer could do to try and promote the kind of growth that developers should have?
That's a good question. What did I ever do as a manager? Maybe nothing. The problem is, you get in everybody that's making decisions is trying to get something done. So every once in a while we run across a rare case where people realize that employees need Slack. Actually, there's a book called Slack. I don't know, probably some of you have read it by Tom DeMarco. Excellent book on how companies work. And the idea is companies typically tend to over-optimize, and they have no slack time. They think of employees as fungible resources that have 100% potential allocation, and they just divide percentages. But Tom DeMarco says you have to bake in slack time for growth and all that kind of thing. I think that's the biggest thing that an employer has to realize is that employees aren't fungible resources with an allocation limit that can be divvied. So that's not really a practical thing, but I'm not attempting to give real advice. Actually, I think everyone should read Slack. That would be a good start. But there are training programs and junk like that. Everybody has their own way of accomplishing things. I think just telling people that Friday afternoon is when you learn something new is probably more valuable and sends a stronger message than having a training budget and signing people up for classes. Because that's almost like a signal that says, to learn something, you wait until the training budget allows you to learn it, and then we send you to a class. That's a bad thing. Unless it's something weird that they're never going to use, that sends a different message. Like, here's something you're never going to use. You're going to spend a week learning about it because we want you to grow and think. But to give people self-directed time, if I were to have a development team right now, that's probably how I would try to do it.
How do you introduce a new idea without sounding like a jerk? And from a manager's perspective, what's an effective way for someone to sell a new idea to you?
Let me see. This assumes that I actually have not sounded like a jerk when I've introduced new ideas. So I'm thinking about times when I've done it. Okay, so I think the first and most important piece of advice I would give here is don't worry about sounding like a jerk. Because most managers want people to give them new ideas, and most employees that report to managers are afraid of sounding like a jerk. So the person that kind of irritates me on occasion, that keeps coming up with stuff, even if I don't like it, at least when I was managing software development teams, that was often the person that I would go to when I had a new idea and say, what do you think about this? Because you start this dialogue. I think that's probably more important. As long as you present something as an idea, I would just present it as an idea and don't worry about how you sound so much unless you get some cue that you're pissing someone off, I mean, you have to learn to talk to people, but you already know how to do that. So I would not worry about sounding like a jerk. So I've just avoided answering the question. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. But I do mean that. It's the people who are contrary, the people that even say, what you did today in that meeting, that actually alienated some of the team members. You shouldn't do that anymore. I appreciate that as a leader much more than someone who doesn't tell me that. It's scary the first time you do it, but I think I had a lot of success, especially in my corporate career, of being overly candid with leaders. So as opposed to like sucking up to people, the higher they went on the ladder, I would actually maybe sometimes dangerously get very, very frank with people, and it worked very well to my advantage. I don't know if that was just luck or what. You had a question?
Yeah, which natural languages do you speak?
Which natural languages do I speak? I speak and read and write Hindi very well, and then a bit of Tibetan. Let's see. Like I used to speak a little Spanish, but mostly it's Hindi and a little English. Yeah. I got interested in Hindi as a hobby because I wanted to be bilingual. This was when I was like 26 or so. And I decided to learn it because we had a bunch of Indian people working with us and I would have someone to practice with. So I just bought a bunch of books and learned it. And now my wife speaks it too, so we have a secret code language. We can speak. It was funny, when we moved to India, we went there. She had never been to India. We were already conversational and she had never been there. We moved there and we were in the airport in Bombay. And we started, I don't remember what we were doing, but we went into this lounge and some guy started speaking Hindi and we looked at each other and they're speaking our language, you know. It's like everybody here speaks our code language. It's very weird.
I guess you talked about some things that maybe I'm going to call like in-domain, but new activities, like, you know, Erlang, other programming languages, or learning about, you know, insurance, whatever that's the field you want to work in. Do you have any examples of like out-of-domain learning environments that you found particularly useful that come back to this software development world? Does anything just strike you around this all?
Well, I'm not going to recommend them, but I've done a lot of studying, obviously, of music and linguistics. And I actually had the realization when I was reading a book about linguistics when I was in India that I was learning about linguistics in terms of music, and then later on as I was reading it was in terms of programming, and I couldn't actually even make a mental separation. So I think all creative, anything creative, if you think about it at the right level, there are things like patterns and, you know, like agile practices apply to composing orchestral music, and design patterns apply to designing your own spoken language or even learning a language, algorithms. It all kind of blends together. So anything that's creative, I think, is beneficial. But that turns into kind of metaphysical discussion, you know, kind of crazy sounding. But
I like crazy. When you said it was like music in the linguistic study, was that like grammars or the sound, spoken sound?
Either way. But I think in the actual instance that I'm referring to, it was about grammar. I can't remember even what book I was reading. But, and it's not so much that I said, ooh, that's like music. It's like my brain snapped and said, oh yeah, I already learned that when I studied such and such. So I just moved on. I recognized in linguistics a pattern that I had learned in music, and therefore I didn't need to read any more about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, get it. Next. But I don't know if everyone would do that.
What are your thoughts on telepathy?